Hello and welcome to episode 27 at the House of Dissent podcast. This is the third episode on historical materialism, and here the focus will concern whether Marx's theory has any relevance today or into the future. Marx had argued that socialism would emerge from capitalism, and that has not happened yet. The change would emerge, he argued, from the inherent contradictions within the system, such as wealth inequalities and more. In the previous episode, I explained that Marxist and neo-Marxist thinkers argued that a key reason for capitalism maintaining itself is largely due to the introduction of mass media communications and the way corporate companies controlled the flow of information, plus advertising, which intensified consumer society. Mass advertising and persuasion led to a huge increase in the production and consumption of commodities, and Marx had referred to this as commodity fetishism. Karl Marx is one of the most influential writers in world history, but was once described in the 1980s as a steam-age socialist by the former right-wing Labour MP David Owen. In other words, Owen argued that Marx's ideas were outdated and redundant in post-industrialized societies. Owen's comments represent a political belief that Marxism was no longer a threat to Western systems, particularly in light of the fact that the former Soviet Union was economically bankrupt. Indeed, another right-wing Labour MP, Denis Healey, once described the Soviet Union as Chad with nuclear weapons. In other words, it was for Healey a failed state that was on its last legs. What this meant for liberal and conservative thinkers was that the failure of the Soviet Union to create a socialist workers' state meant that Marxism had failed as an experiment and was slowly collapsing. Indeed, not long after these comments were made, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, which led Francis Fukuyama to claim that it signified the end of history. In Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man Standing, the author argues that liberal democracies would expand and flourish now that the USSR was no more. In 1990, the American President George H.W. Bush stated that capitalism had defeated communism, and that the collapse of the USSR meant that a new world order had emerged, as he put it. TV images of the Berlin Wall being smashed to pieces was symbolic of the new geopolitical reality, and only 1 year after the collapse of the wall, West and East Germany reunified. German reunification was now complete, and not long after Central and Eastern European countries, either in the orbit of the USSR or close to it, eventually became members of the European Union. In historical terms, this all happened at an astonishing speed, and Marxists were left wondering what would happen next. Indeed, what did happen next was that China turned its economic base into a capitalist model, and the rest, so to speak, is history. China is now an economic powerhouse, all thanks to a capitalist mode of economic production, although, as I have already explained in previous episodes, Xi Jinping has claimed that it's with a Chinese socialist twist. What Fukuyama was doing was articulating in more detail what both David Owen and Denis Healey had said about the ideas of Marx and Marxism, which for Fukuyama was now dead and buried. Fukuyama claimed that the collapse of the Soviet system wasn't a surprise, given its economy was unproductive and unviable. For Fukuyama, it was more of when the system would collapse rather than if. But importantly for him, it wasn't a surprise because those in the former Soviet system were naturally seeking something completely different, which for Fukuyama was compatible with human nature. Fukuyama was arguing that the USSR collapsed primarily because it was a system at odds with what we, the people, apparently naturally seek and want. And although it had flaws, the only system viable that even gets close to what we naturally seek is Western democracy, based on the capitalist mode of production. Therefore, according to Fukuyama, citizens in the former USSR craved for what the West had, not out of envy, but one of a natural inclination to fulfill their true human nature. And they yearned for it because it was in their nature to do so, he argued. The two things most sought after were the pursuit of freedom and individualism, which he argued were the central tenets of Western democracy. This is at odds with Marx's belief that true human nature is communal in context and not individualistic. Who's correct? Perhaps it is tempting to say that it's Fukuyama who is correct, given the fact that the Soviet system collapsed and that communist China and Vietnam, for that matter, have embraced capitalism as a mode of production. But that would be far too simple and would ignore the substantive differences between the Soviet system and what Marx had in mind when he wrote about historical materialism. I'll return to this point later in more detail. But who did Fukuyama look to for his inspiration about the end of history, and what exactly does it mean? Well, this may surprise you, but partly his inspiration was in the first instance the person he was most critical of, Karl Marx. Fukuyama uses Marx's theory of historical materialism to argue against Marx's own conclusions that socialism would emerge out of capitalism. Fukuyama said there would be no going further than capitalism, with all its inequalities and levels of poverty, etc., and said this is the end point of history. This is where the train stops, so to speak, hence he called it the end of history, and for him the collapse of the regimes in the former Soviet system in 1989 was all the proof he needed, because, quite evidently, the people under those regimes had forcefully rejected that system, and moreover yearned for a system directly akin to Western democracy. In simple terms, the end of history means no other mode of production will emerge beyond capitalism. For Fukuyama, the collapse of the USSR introduced the victory of capitalism over communism, and that the new world order that G.H.W. Bush spoke of would dominate from here on in. The philosopher that Fukuyama turned towards to justify his theory about human nature is Hegel, the very same philosopher that Marx had critiqued for his idealism. Fukuyama claims that it is Hegel's theory of recognition which clearly explains why people rejected the Soviet system, a theory in which underpins a liberal concept of human nature. His theory of evolutionary development is based on Hegel's concept of recognition, and in doing so, Fukuyama dismisses the materialist view of history, preferring Hegel's non-materialist account of history, based on what Fukuyama says is the, and I quote, struggle for recognition. Fukuyama says, man wants to be recognized. In particular, he wants to be recognized as a human being. But how can a person who is drowning in high levels of poverty or abject poverty recognize themselves as a human being? Fukuyama is influenced by modernization theory that can be traced back to Max Weber, which argues for a new value system. But interestingly, he pays homage to Marx, at the same time saying, and I quote, Karl Marx, in the preface to the English edition of Das Kapital, had stated, the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its future. Fukuyama's interpretation of Marx's statement is this, and I quote, "This was, consciously or not, the beginning premise of modernization theory." Whilst it is true that Marx critiqued capitalism for its inherent contradictions, he also admired it for being the most dynamic and productive mode of production in world history. Take this quote from Chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto titled Bourgeois and Proletarians, and I quote, "The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labour?" But the quote Fukuyama uses by Marx to justify his claim that it is the premise of modernization theory is misleading, because Marx's quote is not a value judgment on how things should be. It is a fact, and one that will end as socialism emerges from capitalism. Therefore, unlike Fukuyama, Marx's view of modernization under the umbrella of capitalism would end. Fukuyama, on the other hand, used modernization theory to sustain his belief of the end of history. In other words, the continuation of capitalism and liberalism into the unending future. Although modernization has its critics, one important element underlying its theoretical foundations in the developmental process, forcefully advocated by David Lerner, is that a new system of communications is a prerequisite for the establishment and consolidation of a new modernized system. This is an interesting point and validates what Adorno, Horkheimer, and political economy of the media theorists had claimed, that the socialist revolutions didn't happen because of the emergence of mass media communication that was controlled by elites who favoured capitalist production. Indeed, when reflecting on the modernization theory, Wilbur Schramm had argued that the function of the mass media was to coordinate national development. Schramm argued that Western social systems based on particular, and I quote, philosophical rationales or theories were best suited for a democratic media to function properly. In this context, the mass media were morally obliged to organize development. Thus, modernization theory contained the seeds of a set of moral responsibilities that governments would need to recognize and support. Schramm's work was presented in a normative context, an ethical perspective concerning the role of the press, with a responsibility for ensuring a democratic function. It was the American Commission on the Freedom of the Press that was the main influence behind the model for development that was advocated in the four works of the four theories of the press, in which Schramm contributed. As far as Fukuyama was concerned, after 1989, modernization theory, with the inclusion of the press and media in the former USSR, would ensure that the road towards an expansion of liberal democracy would be complete, although that hasn't quite worked out in Russia and the many stands that exist, such as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc. However, in Central and Eastern Europe, the newly developing media landscape was pivotal to the transformation away from a centralized state towards a market economy based on capitalist production. The media was also pivotal towards changing the way people think about culture and identity, which had a huge impact in shifting towards individualism. For instance, I spent years researching in post-communist Romania, producing a book called The Romanian Mass Media and Cultural Development. And one example of how the media transformed a section of Romanian society was the introduction of Western women's magazines into the country. This had a profound impact on female identity in a country whose female role models were featureless, colourless female comrades of the totalitarian regime. Suddenly, female representation in magazines from the West revolutionized the way Romanian women would see themselves. That alone was a profound act of transformation, and given that Ceausescu argued that the role of women in the Romanian police state was to produce children as a so-called revolutionary cause. But such transformations weren't from communism to capitalism. They were away from authoritarian, or in the case of Romania, a totalitarian system to capitalism. Romania, like other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, however, were characterized as communist, and Fukuyama was one of them. Virtually all liberal and conservative writers refer to it as communism because it suits their oversimplified arguments. That, in my view, is wrong and is a fallacy to attempt to convince people that communism is brutal and that therefore socialism, i.e. the road towards communism, is to be rejected for that reason. But the truth is that the old Soviet systems and close associates, such as Romania and Albania, weren't communist systems at all, and you only have to read Marx to understand that. Because Marx argued that under communism, the state would wither away, and moreover, it would ensure a classless society. Now, we can debate whether this is at all possible, but the fact is this. The Soviet systems had a centralized state that was bureaucratic, bloated, and oppressive. And moreover, it was a class, not classless system, and the right at the top of that system were an elite called the nomenklatura, epitomized as the central committees of the so-called communist parties. Images of Marx and Engels were always present at rallies, but that was like a religious fanatical cult using an image of Christ to justify their control over their flock. These systems were police states, to varying degrees, and they can only be defined as Stalinist state bureaucracies created in the image of the grotesque figure of Joseph Stalin. For its part, Romania had moved away from the Soviets in the 1960s during the period of terror, moving away to the period of fear, and modelled their repressive system on North Korea. Albania went through many political transitions, aligning with Yugoslavia, then the USSR, then Mao's China, and finally retreating within itself as an autonomous dictatorial state. In many ways, Fukuyama's analysis is lazy, and considering he served twice at the US Department of State, his work feels propagandistic. Whilst Fukuyama was there, he worked under Paul Wolfowitz, who has been the 10th president of the World Bank and the US Under-Secretary of Defense for the George H.W. Bush government. Yes, the same George Bush who claimed that 1989 represented a new world order which was in tune with Fukuyama's claim of the end of history. Wolfowitz created the Wolfowitz Doctrine in 1992, which became an American defense strategy to secure US hegemony post-1989. Wolfowitz was a chief advocate of the 2003 war in Iraq and told the lie that Iraq had a weapon of mass destruction that justified the US invasion, which was just another failed American war. This was the man Fukuyama worked under. In 2021, Fukuyama gave a speech defending his end of history thesis, where he used China as an example, saying it is hurtling towards a system similar to Japan and other market economies. In his speech to the Long Now Foundation, Fukuyama argues that Marx's theory of historical materialism is in many ways a secular version of the Bible, where the Garden of Eden represents the beginning of history and ends with the arrival of God's kingdom. Thus, according to Fukuyama, Marx replaces the Garden of Eden with the first mode of production, which is tribal ownership, and replaces God's kingdom with communism. Fukuyama's secular take on this is to state that capitalism replaces God's kingdom as the final destination of a modernization process. On page 45 of the 1992 edition of The End of History, Fukuyama says this: "Of the different types of regimes that have emerged in the course of human history, the only form of government that has survived intact to the end of the 20th century has been liberal democracy. What is emerging victorious is not so much liberal practice as the liberal idea." So, is Marx's theory of historical materialism obsolete? Is capitalism the end point of a long historical process that began with tribal ownership? Those questions are hard to answer. It's impossible to predict what lies ahead for humanity. But one thing for sure, it's always been clear to me that the foundations of Fukuyama's wild claims are on an unstable ground. Firstly, let's take his idea of liberal democracy. Even though the American political system is being upended by Trump, which Fukuyama sees as a threat, the idea that a two-party system based on huge amounts of wealth and influence from corporations and political connections to corporations is somehow an example of liberal democracy is a fallacy. Leaving Trump aside for the moment, the American political system is rigged towards the rich and powerful, despite some lone radical voices within the Democrats. In the UK, the political scene has been dominated by the Tories and Labour, a two-party system. The smaller party, the Liberal Democrats, are simply a mirror image of the Labour right and One Nation Tories, and the newly formed Reform Party is a Tory-type party, with many former Tories in its ranks. That said, I don't deny for a moment the possibility of radical left parties emerging in so-called liberal democracies, Fukuyama's terminology, not mine, and that the radical left parties could somehow undermine such systems, just as Marx had argued. For instance, in the UK, the Green Party is currently riding high in the polls, and their policies undermine everything Fukuyama believes in. The Green leader is Zach Polanski, a socialist, a radical, who is influenced by the economist Grace Blakely, who I believe is a democratic socialist. As I've stated previously, democratic socialism is seen as a precursor to socialism, and socialism is seen as a precursor to communism. Make of that what you will. Since Polanski became leader of the Greens in September 2025, their membership has risen to a whopping 200,000. It's staggering. Added to this is the slowly, and I mean slowly, emergence of a radical left party called Your Party, and Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the Labour Party, is the parliamentary leader of Your Party. Of course, the establishment will pull out all their vile stops to alienate those two parties from the British public. When Corbyn was Labour leader, he became the most demonised and ridiculed politician in modern history. An emerging counter-narrative to Fukuyama's gloom and acceptance of poverty, wealth inequalities, war, etc., comes from Clara-Matti. In her book called Escape from Capitalism, which has gained media attention at Channel 4 and The Guardian in the United Kingdom, two liberal media organisations. Matti is an Italian economist who uses Marxist methodology to analyse and critique capitalism. And whilst I'm not going into detail about her work here, what I will say is that it's clear that she rejects the end of history theory and believes that Marx's theory of historical materialism is alive and kicking. This leads me to a point I made in previous episodes regarding Xi Jinping's argument that, as Marx and Engels predicted, socialism will emerge from capitalism, although the current Chinese system is not something I would align myself with. For anyone who may be interested, Clara-Matti was asked to explain her position on Channel 4's podcast called Ways to Change the World. The episode is titled Clara-Matti, Capitalism is not neutral, it's enforced. Matti's analysis is sharp, but it's not something completely new. Many Marxist writers have made these points before, but never received the media attention Matti is currently getting. I recall when I first heard Ernest Mandel speak forcefully and critically about capitalism. As an economist, he made those points Matti's making back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Mandel, a Belgian Marxist economist, wrote Late Capitalism, amongst other works, which is worth reading now. Mandel was a superb speaker, and he not only survived the Holocaust, he also fought in the resistance against the Nazis. He was also a Trotskyist, belonging to the Belgian branch of the Fourth International. I belong to the British branch of the Fourth International, and my advice to people like Fukuyama and his supporters is to read Leon Trotsky's masterpiece, The Revolution Betrayed. Everything is there for Fukuyama to read about the substantive difference between Marx's writings, beliefs, and what occurred in the Soviet Union. If Fukuyama had read it, he would know that the Stalinist states, those bloated bureaucracies, those police states, those class-ridden systems, were not communist at all. Therefore his theory, the end of history, to paraphrase Marshall Berman, evaporates into air. Trotsky called the Soviet Union a degenerated workers' state, with its centralized system of control over all aspects of life, and one that obliterated the power of workers. It was far removed from socialism as capitalism is from feudalism. Trotsky foresaw the inevitable collapse of the Stalinist system, and if he were alive when Fukuyama wrote his book, he would have probably told him something like this: I knew this would have happened. It was inevitable. But what Trotsky did not know is what exactly would replace the rancid police states. Consider this quote from The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1937, and I quote, "The fall of the present bureaucratic dictatorship, if it were not replaced by a new socialist power, would thus mean a return to capitalist relations, with a catastrophic decline of industry and culture. The collapse of the degenerated workers' state in 1989 resulted in the expansion of capitalism, as Trotsky foretold. But it did not signify the end of history. It did not signify the end stop of historical materialism. It signified that socialism has yet to be achieved, in the face of the huge blockade placed before it from the Stalinist regimes that annihilated Marxists. There is one other important issue worth considering in the context of modern-day capitalism, and that is the impact of artificial intelligence on employment. AI within the capitalist mode of production will affect labour and surplus value in ways hitherto unknown. It will also impact alienation, commodity production, commodity fetishism, and the division of labour, which I have previously discussed, which makes for a fascinating research project. But if the consequences of AI displaces workers and becomes far more profitable for companies, then what? How secure will capitalism be as companies and countries increase competition through cheaper, non-unionized costs? As unemployment increases, which surely will intensify class conflict, which is the very dynamic of dialectical change from one mode of production to another. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please click like, leave a comment, or follow me. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.